I'm Jamie Buckingham. Shalom from Israel. I have some dear friends who live in a small community in the desert in western Utah. Many years ago, they withdrew from the Mormon church, bought what was formerly desert wasteland, and settled there. They dug wells, built their little houses in a circle, farmed the fields, and raised the finest dairy cows in Utah. They live a true communal life, working hard, educating their children, worshiping the Lord, and holding all their possessions in common. No private ownership. Although they're Spirit-filled Christians, they observe Saturday as the Sabbath. Whatever the Bible says is everlasting, their leader told me, should be observed as everlasting. We do not find any place where God has canceled out his command, 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. It's a delight. It should be observed as a time of special communion with God, he said. In this lesson, we'll see what the Bible has to say about this. In this video, you'll join me standing in a grain field in northern Israel. Perhaps it was here where Jesus came on a certain Sabbath day many years ago.
Nothing characterizes Jewish life as much as the Sabbath, Shabbat in Hebrew. The Hebrew word Shabbat literally means rest and is taken from Genesis 2:2, where on the seventh day of creation God rested. He hallowed that day for all mankind. Later, that concept became the fourth commandment and is still venerated by Jews all over the world as the primary thing that sets them apart from the world. Here in Israel, everything changes on the Shabbat. All Jewish shops close. The buses don't run. The elevators in the Jewish hotels go into automative sequence, which means that they automatically stop at every floor so the Jews don't have to work by pushing the button. Electric lights in the homes come on and off automatically, so the Orthodox don't have to throw the switches, which would be work. Even El Al, the national Jewish airlines, does not take off or land on the Sabbath. Meals in hotel kitchens as well as homes are cooked the day before. It's a special day, a day of rest, a day of worship. The Sabbath begins at sundown on Friday and ends at sundown on Saturday. In Jewish homes, it's welcomed as a bride, as the women of the house light the Shabbat candles. Like today's Jewish families, Jesus kept the Sabbath. It was to him a holy day, a day of delight. How do we make a day holy? The answer is, in the Ten Commandments, there are two versions, one in Exodus and one in Deuteronomy. They're almost identical with one exception. Exodus says to remember the Sabbath, while Deuteronomy says to observe or keep the Sabbath. In the Jewish Kiddush, which is recited over a cup of wine to usher in the Sabbath, both these concepts are found. Thou hast graciously given us thy holy Sabbath as a heritage in remembrance of creation, the first among the holy convocations to recall the Exodus from Egypt. In the Kiddush, we find both creation and liberation from bondage. Remember the reasons for the Sabbath, observe or keep, and to remember.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav, v'retzavanu v'shabbat kodsho, ba'ahavat u'v'ratzon hinchilanu, zikaron l'ma'aseh v'reishit, techila l'mikrei kodesh, zecher l'tziat Mitzrayim, v'shabbat kodshecha ba'ahava u'v'ratzon hinchilan tanu, Baruch atah Adonai mekadesh ha-Shabbat. Amen. Amen.
When God gave the Sabbath commands, it was to remind us that we're a chosen people. We're a people of great worth. That extends to all people. Therefore, it would be unthinkable for a Jew to do as some Christians might do and pay someone to work for us so we could observe Sunday in peace and rest. To hire someone to work for you on the Sabbath would be unthinkable, because you see, the person we would hire is of equal worth to God and should be observing the Sabbath also. Obeying the restrictions of the Sabbath had reason, not just so the human body could rest, but to bring us into God's presence in a new and fresh way every week. It was to be a time of celebration and joy. All laws of mourning are suspended on the Sabbath. In fact, some of the rabbis went so far as to forbid crying on the Sabbath. It's a day of detachment from things and a day of attachment to the Spirit. But the Jews of Jesus' day carried these restrictions far beyond what God had intended. In fact, the laws were so restrictive you could hardly breathe. You were forbidden to lace your sandals, since that was work. You were forbidden to walk more than a certain number of paces. When Jesus spit on the ground and made mud to put on the eyes of a blind man to heal him, the Pharisees went into a rage and said he had broken the Sabbath by making mud. Finally, Jesus said to them, "Listen, fellas, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath." Jesus was standing beside a grain field near the Sea of Galilee when he made that statement. Behind him were the high Golan Heights. The disciples began to pick some grain, rub them in their hands to eat the kernels. The Pharisees saw them and began shouting, "What you're doing is unlawful, shucking grain on the Sabbath." Jesus gently reminded them that King David did something far worse when he and his companions were hungry. They entered the temple, and taking the showbread, the consecrated bread, he ate what was lawful only for the priest to eat. Then he said something which infuriated them. "The Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath." What did he mean? Well, he meant, I, God, created the Sabbath for your benefit. I made the rules to start with. I alone am capable of interpreting them. Both keeping and remembering the Sabbath are important. Most of us in our Western culture no longer think the Sabbath is important. Jesus thought it was extremely important. But even more important was man's relationship with the Lord of the Sabbath. Today, on the seventh day of the week, take time to renew your vow to remember the Sabbath and to observe the Sabbath and to keep it holy. And may you have, as the Jews here in Israel say, good Shabbat.